Hey everybody, doing something a little different today. I'm going to let this replay of mine roll and just talk about Dariusburst Another Chronicle. So it's going to be kind of a short introduction to and a quick review of this game. And it's an interesting one, even if my feelings on it are complicated. So a little bit of context here. One surprising thing that happened to me this year was me becoming kind of a Darius fan. I didn't expect to like the first 3 Darius games as much as I did because gameplay-wise they're a bit more old school than what I usually prefer. And to be perfectly clear, their gameplay flavor still isn't my favorite. But that doesn't really matter that much because the series has some of the coolest vibes in all of shmups with their trippy spacefish theming, beautiful pixel graphics, and of course those soundtracks by Taito's sound team, Zuntata. And if you're not familiar with these games, I have commentated clears of Darius 1, 2 and Gaiden available on my channel. So I've been pretty excited to try out the 2 remaining main titles, which are G-Darius and Dariusburst. In my quest of going through the series in a chronologically confused order, I chose to play Burst before G. But the main point of this long preamble is that I went into those earlier Darius games with no expectations. This time the situation's different, and it colors my experience. Dariusburst has a famously convoluted history. It was originally a PSP game released in 2009, which was then reworked into an arcade game in 2010, named Dariusburst Another Chronicle. This was then followed by an updated EX version in 2011. Probably the most well-known iteration is 2015's Dariusburst Chronicle Saviors, which added a whole big campaign mode specifically for home play. I'm playing the Another Chronicle EX Plus from 2021, which doesn't have the Chronicle Saviors mode, but it does have some nice additional features on the arcade side. I'll cover those at the end of this video because I want to get into discussing the actual gameplay before I start bleeding viewers. So, to me there are 3 key points that define this entry in the series. The first one is the return of the ultra-wide aspect ratio seen in Darius 1. It looks a bit sad when played on a single screen with that huge wasted screen estate, but it is certainly unique. The second thing is that the routes are now much shorter, with an average playthrough taking maybe around 12 minutes, but there's way more of them now. So it's less about practicing to get that elusive 1cc, and more about doing route after route after route. And then thirdly, we have the titular burst mechanic. As you destroy enemies, you fill up a meter that you can then use to unleash a special attack, which not only does more damage, but can also cancel bullets and counter these huge laser attacks that the bosses like to do. And those are the 3 main things you need to know about Dariusburst. And I think they're pretty interesting. Dariusburst feels like a Darius game while having a personality of its own. It both respects and plays with the classic formula. There's other stuff that I like about the game as well. First and foremost, the soundtrack is amazing, though this particular route unfortunately isn't quite the best showcase for it. Again, it continues the series' tradition of having strange dreamlike music while going out into its own original direction. For me, it's the emotional core of the game. The only nitpick I have is that the track Freedom is exclusive to Chronicle Saviors and thus doesn't appear in the version that I have. Because Freedom rules. See you in the comments section. I also appreciate the variety of the ships. There's different varieties of burst ships, as you would expect, but then there's also stuff like the ship from Darius 2, which has no burst whatsoever, but seems to really dish out damage if you get into point-blank range. The ship you choose really affects the feel of the gameplay, which goes well together with the pick up and play nature of the shorter runs. I ended up really vibing with the Gaiden ship, which has a rechargeable bomb instead of a burst laser, because personally I'm more into skillful dodging than skillfully timing attacks and counters, but choosing when to deploy your bomb means there's still a dash of tactical depth to it. It's really cool how the game lets you approach it in these different ways. The run that you're watching right now is done with the Gaiden ship, and it's a no-miss run of the final routes of the original Another Chronicle arcade game, not the harder EX variants. I know, it's confusing, but don't worry too much about it because, honestly, the game doesn't really worry about it too much either. The big problem of Dariusburst for me is the lack of thoughtful stage design. I just don't find a lot of the enemies or patterns very compelling. I mean, you've got popcorn waves, asteroids, homing lasers, all that classic stuff, but somehow it just doesn't feel that exciting here. Now, of course, the game tries to create interesting situations by mixing these up, which is what most shmups do, but the building blocks are just a bit too basic and combined in ways that seem random. This doesn't mean that the game can't get challenging, but the challenge often seems to come from the screen being this mess of intersecting patterns and other hazards, instead of being something creatively designed to create a specific kind of experience. The bosses are more interesting than the stages, and I like how many of them utilize the whole screen estate, but even their patterns feel kind of stock and some of the fights drag on for far too long. You're kind of doing the same thing over and over. And that leads directly to my other major criticism, which is something that is good in real life, but bad in video games, and that's recycling. I've seen a lot of reviews call this one of the most content-rich shmups around, and I have to disagree. It's not content if you take a small amount of gameplay elements, most of which aren't that exciting to begin with, and then shuffle them around endlessly. Now, obviously, I haven't played all of the possible routes and missions in this game, and I don't even have the Chronicle Saviors mode available to me. But I started to feel kind of a tiring sense of sameness just exploring the 12 stages of original mode. And it only deepened when I started sampling the EX mode and the events. I'm not saying there's no fun or even unique content in those modes, it just feels procedurally generated to me, even though, as far as I know, it's not. I saw somebody describe this game with the expression, more is less, and that's definitely my sentiment as well. The early Darius games didn't necessarily have super involved stage design or boss patterns either, but I think those games are really helped by their strong visuals and atmosphere, and this is where those expectations come into play. I don't think I'm usually too picky about graphics, but with the Darius series, it's a huge part of what makes it memorable. And that's why I feel that the bland visuals of Dariusburst hurt it quite a bit. A lot of the game's vibe is carried by the fish theming and the excellent music, but all the environments tend to blend together and the graphics have this sort of sterile look to them, which is probably the result of it being a reworked PSP game. Burst carries the outward appearance of the Darius series, but not the soul of its aesthetics. It's just not the same. Before rushing into my final thoughts, I want to take a moment to say something positive for a change and give a shout out to this particular version that I'm playing, which again is Another Chronicle EX+. It gets a lot of flack for being kind of a superfluous release, because the earlier Dariusburst Chronicle Saviors already included the Another Chronicle arcade game, and I agree that what Taito is doing with all of these separate releases is unnecessary and annoying. But if you're like me and primarily into arcade runs instead of progressing through a long campaign, it has 3 neat features that might interest you. First of all, it has replays, So if you like sharing your clears, it's super convenient to have a built-in replay mode instead of having to have your capture card running on all of the time. Secondly, the Murakumo ship is now available in arcade mode, and it's a pretty unique and cool one to play with, not just a throwaway addition. And thirdly, EX Plus has an event mode, which has actual old events that they used to run on the arcade caps back in the game's heyday, which is extremely cool from a historical point of view. But there's also some new events, and surprisingly, most of them are boss rushes or even just individual bosses, which is handy for practicing since the game lacks a dedicated practice mode. To be blunt, there's no reason why this stuff couldn't have been added into Chronicle Saviors, but things being what they are, if you're interested in the arcade side of Dariusburst Another Chronicle, the small but substantial changes made in EX Plus might be worth a look. So, in conclusion, do I consider Dariusburst a disaster? No. I think it's a game that is very easy to have a bit of fun with, without needing to put a ton of practice or research in first. Like, I've been dipping my toes into Great Mahodai Saxon since I'm on a bit of a rising spree. There's like an inventory system in that game and changing polarities and all kinds of stuff. So I've been kind of putting it off, even though I think I'll end up liking it a lot once I, finally get into it. With Dariusburst, you can just fire it up, choose a route you haven't played, maybe try a ship you're less familiar with, and just be off blasting stuff for a quarter of an hour. And there's some value in that. Also, I can see this being an approachable entry point for some new players of the genre, where you don't need to dedicate yourself to a single game to be able to enjoy it and get some clears. But from the perspective of a recent Darius convert, I can't help but feel disappointed. Apart from the soundtrack, Burst just doesn't touch me in the same way that the other games in the series do. But I'm pretty hopeful that G-Darius will revive my spirits and capture me into a bowl of surreal spacefish goodness once again. If you've played this game, I'm curious to hear what you think about it, because from what I can see, a lot of the discourse around this game seems to concentrate on the differences between the versions and all the modes and the DLC ships and all that stuff. There's less on the actual gameplay experience and on whether it makes sense to remix a game over and over this way. So please let me know if you have any thoughts about this one. And that's it. That's the video. Thanks for watching as always, enjoy the beautiful ending music, and see you again next time.